Well, hey, everybody, and welcome to this midweek review with Mr. John. I am Mr. John. Of course, I am. I wouldn't be doing this if I wasn't Mr. John, called Mr. John's Bible Fun. But we have been talking about Moses. Remember, he was put into a basket, and the unbelievable thing about him floating down the Nile River is that he is picked up by the Pharaoh's daughter. The Pharaoh being the person that decreed that all Israelite boy babies would be thrown in the Nile to die. And here is Moses floating along the Nile being picked up by the very daughter of that Pharaoh. We also see that Moses' mom actually becomes his nanny, which he is taught that his Hebrew background, and he's raised Egyptian prince, right? He grows up knowing these two different worlds. And then one day he sees an Egyptian fighting or whipping or doing something against an Israelite, and the Israelite is getting beaten. And Moses sees that, and he just can't have that happen. So he ends up getting in an altercation with this guy and ends up killing him. And so, knowing the law of Egypt, that any Egyptian who killed another Egyptian was sentenced to death, Moses runs. We heard last week about Moses being a shepherd. For 40 years he's been a shepherd, and now all of a sudden he sees something in the mountains, and he goes to find out what it is. You know, he sees a glow and think it's a fire, and has to get this taken care of so he can protect the sheep. And he comes upon a fire, a burning bush. But he notices real quick that the bush is not being consumed by the fire. Like when we roast a marshmallow, right? We put it in the fire, and all of a sudden, it catches on fire. It turns all black. It's being consumed by the fire. So we see the bush not consumed, but we also hear that it talks. And Moses is talking to God. And God gives Moses this incredible task to free his people, because he has heard their cries, and he is going to finally free them from their bondage from the Egyptians, and sends Moses out. Now Moses, a little apprehensive, is convinced that God has got his back and that he will speak for him when needed, and he goes upon Pharaoh, and he sits there and goes, I am Moses, I am speaking for God. You know, everything that God told him to say, he says to Pharaoh. And then he goes, basically, let my people go. And the Pharaoh looks at Moses and just kind of probably, who is this guy? He's kind of, right? Pharaoh's got to think this, right? You know, one guy comes in with a staff and let my people go. And Pharaoh says no. And so Moses goes and takes his plea to God. And God says, go back to Pharaoh, tell him that if he doesn't let my people go, God says this, and says, doesn't let my people go, there will be a plague set upon Egypt. And so Moses goes back to Pharaoh. Hey, Pharaoh, dude, I just talked to God, and God says, let my people go. And again, Pharaoh says no, which upon Moses gives his staff to his brother Aaron. Aaron just pokes the staff into the Nile River, and whoa, the Nile River turns to blood. Now, we think of this, and I want you to realize the enormity of this, right? Back then, they couldn't go to the 7-Eleven and grab a Slurpee or hit the soda machine. They couldn't go and do things that would get them an energy drink or a Gatorade or things like that. Basically, their life source for fluids was water from the Nile. And here it is taken away. But not only think about water for the people, there's no water for the animals either, right? No water for crops. Things are going to start to dry up. Things are starting to decay. The animals are getting thirsty and not producing milk, say the cows, like they would if they would go to drink milk. So a lot of this is going on, and we got to think about the fish. Fish live in water. They can't breathe blood. They breathe water. They breathe the carbon dioxide in the water, not of blood. And so they die, a huge food source. Moses goes back to Pharaoh, let my people go. Again, no. And then it's a constant back and forth with Moses and Pharaoh. And each time Pharaoh says no, another plague is unleashed. There's the plague of frogs. That was number 2. And if whatever Bible you kind of read, there's different versions. Some say gnats. Some say lice is the third one. Then there's the plague of flies. Then there's the plague of animals getting sick and dying. And then we see the plague of boils, the plague of hail, the plague of locusts, the plague of darkness. And I want to talk a little bit about the darkness one. This one is cool because I think it is a foreshadowing of Jesus coming, right? God sits there and tells Moses that it's going to be dark in Egypt, but God is going to spare the Israelites of this darkness. And this darkness lasts for 3 days. Now, if we remember when Jesus is crucified on the cross, he's hung on the cross and he dies and he's buried. And that lasts for 3 days. The world is put into total darkness for 3 days. And then on that third day, he rises again. But think about it this way too. The people who do not believe in who Jesus or God were at the time. Now, they wouldn't know Jesus, right? Jesus isn't born yet. But think about it. They don't know who God is. And so they're put into darkness. And I don't mean just walking around your house at night with the lights off and you can kind of see, I can't see my hand in front of my face dark, right? But the Israelites, because they don't believe, they're put in darkness. And those that believe, the Israelite nation, the Israelites, they're in the light. And there's a thing that Jesus is called. He is called the light of God. And so it's really a kind of a foreshadowing of what's to come later. But the 10th plague is also, I think, a foreshadowing of what's to come later with Jesus, and that is the angel of death. And we know it as the angel of death of the firstborn, and now we've come to know it as the Passover. God tells Pharaoh that since you're not going to let my people go, I am going to put this really bad plague upon you. And this one is all the firstborn males are going to die. Now, listen, I'm a firstborn male. That means even at my age, and I'm up there, I would have died. But God gives the Israelites the remedy. He sits there and says, you need to take an unblemished lamb, a perfect lamb. You need to take it and sacrifice this lamb, take its blood and put it on your doorpost. And when the angel of death comes down, he will go be floating by the cities and all the houses, and he will look upon your door. And if he sees the blood on the doorpost, he will just pass by, saving the Israelite babies. Remember, the Egyptians did not believe in God. Even if they heard this decree, they would think it was ludicrous. They would think it's no way this is just baloney. Even they would even think the angel of death, even though after all these plagues was kind of a baloney thing, right? But the angel of death comes through Egypt and wipes out all the firstborn. And it just doesn't attack the firstborn person. It takes the firstborn male of the animals too. And this is huge. So the foreshadowing of Jesus is that Jesus takes away our sin, right? But we have to believe in him. And Jesus, also called the Lamb of God, is that perfect sacrifice for us that takes away the sins of the world, the sins of us. But he had to sacrifice on the cross. But if we believe, his blood, the blood he shed, is put on our doorposts, basically. And it saves us from a life with him. It gives us a life with him, and it saves us a life from being in hell. So Pharaoh finally sees this, and he lets God's people go. This was just too much for him to bear. But we will see if Pharaoh can keep this in his mind, that it's okay. So let's take the verse that's coming up. Let's put it in our heart. Let's talk about to others who God is, who Jesus is, maybe who Moses is. Tell them this story. It's a great story. But guys, I don't want you to not understand the enormity of all these plagues. When I talk about gnats, it wasn't just like that little cloud of gnats you see when you walk in your yard. This isn't a cloud of gnats. This is the sky of gnats. It's just huge. So God went to enormous lengths to save his people, and he goes to enormous lengths to save you. So if you believe, you are saved, my friend. So if you have questions about that, hey, hit me up in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to talk with you. So we will talk to you next week. Have a good one. Bye, guys. Show me your ways, Lord. Teach me your paths. Psalm 25:4.